It is the only crime I can think of where there are no victims. If you think about it, if it had worked properly and the painting was sold for an amount of money, it would then have developed a life of its own and would just have gone on into the future, changing hands as they do for years to come. And no one would have lost any money.
All right, everyone, grab another cup of whatever you're sipping on. For me, it's a zero sugar Dr. Pepper, because we're diving into a story that's less about ancient battles and more about modern day trickery in the high stakes world of art. Today, I'm going to take you on a fascinating and frankly a little bit scandalous of a journey into the world of John Myatt and John Drewe, the duo behind one of the most audacious art forgery rings of the 20th century. Hey there, history buffs and gamers. Welcome back to Historically Gaming. Now, we've talked about power struggles and dynastic squabbles, but today we're shifting gears to a different kind of deception. The kind that involves a paintbrush, some household emulsion, and a whole lot of audacious lying. We're going deep into the story of John Myatt, the talented artist, and John Drewe, the con man extraordinaire, who together managed to fool the art world for years. So let's set the scene. The late 20th century art market was booming. Prices for works by modern masters were skyrocketing, creating a lucrative, albeit sometimes murky, environment. Enter John Myatt. Now, Myatt wasn't some criminal mastermind from the get-go. He was a struggling artist, a former art teacher, just trying to make ends meet after his marriage ended in the mid-80s. He even started advertising genuine fakes in the Private Eye. You know, those satirical magazines. He was upfront about them being copies, selling them for a modest sum, like around £150. Think of it as artistic fan fiction, if you will. Then in walks John Drewe. This guy, he was something else. He presented himself as a nuclear physicist with supposed connections to British intelligence. Smooth talker, full of impressive sounding but ultimately fabricated credentials. Drewe saw an opportunity in Myatt's talent. He commissioned several paintings from Myatt, and then the game changed.
There was a man called, it was a very nice man called Mr. John Drewe, and we became good friends. For a year he worked as a normal customer. I worked, I must have done him about 10 paintings for £250 each. Normally, I think most people had 2 or 3 paintings, but this one particular person had painting after painting after painting after painting, and it was quite strange actually. But he was a good customer, and his checks didn't bounce, so I was very happy with that. And as he got to know me better, I suppose he found out about my domestic circumstances, how things were at home, and he called up one day and said, "Look, that painting you just sold me for £250. I took it down to Christie's last week, and they valued it at £25,000.
Drewe casually mentioned that Christie's had valued one of Myatt's, Albert Gleisel's, fakes as a whopping £25,000. Now, whether this was a complete fabrication or a misunderstanding Drewe deliberately twisted, it doesn't matter. The seed of deception was planted. Myatt went from making honest copies to believing his work could pass as the real deal, especially with Drewe's expertise. And that's where the real con began.
I never did exact copies. I don't think there's any point in doing. Any fool can do that, really. What I did was I looked at the artist that I was interested in, and I looked at the problems that they were looking at in, say, 1920, 1930, 1940, and I painted another painting, created a new painting that could have come from that artist in that time. So they were totally new works each time. Didn't always work, but quite often it was a good move.
Myatt, with his impressive ability to mimic the styles of artists like Matisse, Chagall, Klee, you name it, started turning out these forgeries. What's wild is the materials he used. We're not talking fancy oil paints here. We're talking household emulsions mixed with KY jelly to get the right consistency. Sometimes he'd even sprinkle in coffee grounds or vacuum cleaner dust to try and give the paintings a bit of an aged look. It sounds almost comical, but the results were convincing enough to fool many. But here's where Drewe's genius, in a twisted criminal sense, really shines. He understood that a good forgery isn't just about the painting itself, it's about the story behind it, the provenance, if you will. You can't just walk into Christie's with a newly discovered Matisse and expect them to take your word for it. It needs a history, a paper trail, and Drewe was a master at creating just that. He meticulously fabricated certificates of authenticity, invoices, all sorts of documents to suggest these paintings had been owned by legitimate collectors in the past. Maybe some obscure European families or forgotten estates. He'd weave these elaborate tales about how he'd acquired them, but he didn't stop there, guys. This is where it gets truly audacious. Drewe actually managed to gain access to the archives of some of the most prestigious art institutions in Britain, like the Tate Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Can you believe it? He posed as a researcher, sometimes even make a small donation to gain their trust. Once inside, he would steal or even more incredibly alter the records. He'd insert information about Myatt's forgeries into old exhibition catalogs, creating a false history for them. He even went as far as to insert entire fake pages into these historical documents. It's like rewriting history, but for the sake of art fraud. He didn't just rely on forged documents and tampered archives, though. Drewe was a master manipulator of people, too. He would contact relatives of the artists Myatt was forging, trying to trick them into authenticating the works. He'd enlist friends and acquaintances to play the role of previous owners, spinning elaborate lies about how they came to possess these lost masterpieces. He used intermediaries to sell the paintings through reputable auction houses and dealers in London, Paris, and New York, adding layers of perceived legitimacy and distancing himself and Myatt from the actual sales. It was a complex web of deceit, all orchestrated by Drewe. Now, you might be wondering, how did this whole thing unravel? Well, like many criminal partnerships, it started to fray due to money. Myatt wasn't seeing a fair share of the profits. Drewe was the one living the high life, while Myatt was still relatively struggling. This created resentment and eventually led to their split around 1993. The real crack in the facade came in 1995. An ex-partner of Drewe, feeling wronged, decided to spill the beans to Scotland Yard. Suddenly, the art world's dirty secret was out in the open. Myatt was arrested in September of 1995, and surprisingly, he confessed relatively quickly. He cooperated with the police, providing crucial details about the forgeries and actually offering to help them build a case against Drewe. The trial in 1998 was a sensation. The art world held its breath as the details of the elaborate scam came to light. And in 1999, John Myatt received a 1-year prison sentence for conspiracy to defraud, though he was eventually released after just about 4 months for good behavior. John Drewe, the manipulative mastermind, on the other hand, was hit with a 6-year sentence for a whole laundry list of charges. We got conspiracy to defraud, forgery, theft, false accounting, and using a false instrument. The fallout from the Myatt and Drewe scandal was significant. It sent shockwaves through the art market, forcing institutions and collectors to reevaluate their authentication processes. It highlighted the vulnerability of even the most prestigious archives and the power of a convincing lie. It's believed that many of their forgeries are still out there, hanging in collections, bought and sold as genuine masterpieces. The true scale of their operation and the number of undetected fakes may never be fully known, which is a pretty unsettling thought when you consider the value placed on these artworks. But here's a fascinating twist to the story. After serving his time, John Myatt didn't disappear into obscurity. He actually reinvented himself as a legitimate artist. He now openly creates and sells his genuine fakes, paintings in the style of famous artists, but clearly marked as copies. And guess what? They're actually really popular. People appreciate his skill, and it offers a more affordable way to own a piece that evokes the style of a master. He's even appeared on television and occasionally assists law enforcement with art fraud investigations. Talk about a redemption arc. The story of John Myatt and John Drewe is a wild ride. It's a tale of artistic talent, twisted by greed and manipulation, of the vulnerability of even the most esteemed institutions, and the enduring power of a well-crafted lie. It serves as a cautionary tale for the art world and a reminder that sometimes things aren't always what they seem, and even when they're hanging in a gilded frame. So there you have it, the intricate and rather unbelievable story of John Myatt and John Drewe. It's a far cry from medieval battles, but it's a fascinating look at a different kind of historical deception. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the art world's underbelly, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unexpected historical tales. Until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!